Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual component of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we welcome back to our halls Judith Butler, celebrating the publication of their timely new book titled Who's Afraid of Gender, published by Farrar Straus Giroux. Before we begin, as is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. Dozens of dialects were spoken along this peninsula. We'd like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Judith Butler's writings have redefined how we think about gender and sexuality. Their book, Gender Trouble, was a groundbreaking treatise on the subject, and over the years, Professor Butler has followed up that iconic tome with numerous influential books, placing them at the forefront of the intellectual life, both here and abroad. The new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, doesn't aim to develop a new theory of gender, but to examine how the subject of gender has become a kind of a boogeyman, utilized by the far right to demonize struggles for equality and justice. Emerging authoritarian regimes coming together with openly fascist political factions, as well as trans exclusionary feminists, have developed platforms for an anti-gender ideology designed to scapegoat trans and queer people and strip them of their rights to pursue a life without fear of violence. This worldwide reactionary movement has sought to nullify reproductive justice, undermine protections against sexual and gender violence, and in some countries has gone as far as to criminalize sexual freedom and gender choice, actually issuing capital punishment. Who's Afraid of Gender arrives to us at a very significant sociopolitical crossroads and explores the pathology of these authoritarian movements, challenging us to refuse the alliance with those who seek to oppress. It encourages us to begin building a broad coalition with all of those who struggle for equality and fight against injustice. Who's Afraid of Gender imagines new possibilities for both freedom and solidarity. Joining Judith Butler tonight in conversation is none other than Maggie Nelson. Maggie Nelson is the author of several acclaimed books of poetry and prose, including Like Love, Essays and Conversations, so the national bestseller on freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, and also the National Book Critics Circle Award winner and international bestseller, The Argonauts, a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She's currently a professor of English at the University of Southern California. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Judith Butler and Maggie Nelson. An honor to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. My great honor and pleasure to be here.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Judith. This is so great for me. And I guess I just wanted to start off with some gratitude. Before I even signed on to talking to you tonight, I had already listened to the Chris Hayes and the David Remnick. I listened to all whatever was out there to listen to. I was already watching and listening to how you were talking about the book. So I actually felt I felt both happy to come and ask my own questions, which differ quite a bit, I think, probably from theirs. But I also just felt like I'd already been feeling a lot of gratitude for all the work you've been doing and talking about. I mean, writing the book and then talking about it and, offering up. Like, I felt like when I read the book, I felt like this was a book that perhaps you needed to write, and we can talk about that. But I also got a strong sense of a kind of generosity of offering up a compilation, an archive, a set of queries, a set of insights that kind of just needed to be offered. And so I just wanted to say thanks for all that work.
Yeah, well, thank you, Maggie.
So, like I said, for people who haven't read the book, if you want to get a primer, and I kind of am gathering that maybe given the nature of our geographic location and other things, that maybe we don't need as much of a primer on some of the issues in the book. So my questions are, they're selfishly my questions. They're not meant to give people a kind of lay of the land of what the book is about. So I hope that's all right. And I encourage you people to buy the book and read it to get that lay of the land itself. So I guess I just wanted to start off with maybe like the tone of the book. And I was interested, I can't remember where it was, and something I listened to you say, I think probably recently, you were talking about philosophy and calmness and the importance of that. And I thought, I was really interested in just hearing you say more um, about that calmness and how maybe it relates to what in the force of nonviolence you talk about as critical patience. I guess because I wasn't hearing it in this kind of normative way about philosophy as a kind of calming of the passions, like as a cognitive activity that would repress them or alchemize them, but maybe more as just like a clearing space for curiosity about them. And in this way, there's a lot of psychoanalytic vibes about making that space in your work. So I was interested in that. And I was also interested in the way that, because a lot of the book is about what to do in the face of fascist passions or rising autocracy. Like on Timothy Snyder's list of ways to resist autocracy, he has number 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. And he's talking more about be wary of states of emergency and whatnot. But because the word calmness had already been in my mind vis-a-vis your book, I wondered if you had anything else to say about it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't recommend calmness all the time, or even
Yeah.
as a way of life. And I don't actually consider myself a particularly calm person. So, but I mean, the book arose, as you know, from this experience I had in Brazil of people screaming at me, and I couldn't really understand why they were so angry and what they thought I might be or what I represented, right? So this was a situation in which I was burnt in effigy by right-wing Christians and told I was a pedophile and told as well to leave the country, that I was the devil and that I needed to be driven from the land. So that was surprising. I mean, I knew that there was a right-wing movement against the idea of gender, but I only started studying it after that experience. And I was very grateful to scholars in Brazil, Sonia Correa, among others, who gave me a lot to read and started to tell me about that history. And I came to understand, especially through friends who had been working on this in France and Belgium, that the anti-gender movement started with the Vatican and went through Latin America and caused something of a frenzy as it entered into the evangelical church and as the right-wing Catholic Church became even more fanatic. So I'm not going to convert those people. I'm not going to persuade those people, no matter how persuasive I might think I am, because they're writing passions that are overwhelming them. And they have figured gender along with critical race theory and ethnic studies and migration as a threat to civilization, to their family, to their masculinity, their femininity, the idea of man, almost everything. So the only people I could really convince are people in the middle who are confused, who know something is happening, but they don't really understand it, or they might find gender disturbing in some way because they've taken for granted that their own gender is a kind of natural fact. So I wasn't really looking to persuade people who already agree with me, even though I gather some critics think I'm doing that. That wasn't my intention. My intention was really to try to bring the temperature down on some of these debates. And as you know, the fights between trans exclusionary feminists and trans feminist and trans people and gender queer people have been very intense, especially in the UK, sometimes in Spain, sometimes in Italy, and sometimes in the US. Very very heightened, very escalated, with lots of invective and hatred and accusation. So trying to figure out what it's about in a calmer way seemed the best way to get people to wake up to the fact that this is that are internal debates
Mhm.
within feminism or within feminist, queer, trans worlds are actually part of a much larger
Mhm.
anti-gender ideology movement that's been with us for several decades now. And it's important that we reposition our local arguments
Mhm.
within that larger frame. One reason we're seeing some
Mhm.
small group of feminists, but vocal,
Mhm.
reiterating the same logics that
Mhm.
right-wing anti-feminists are speaking, is that they don't understand that some of the arguments they're making are actually part of authoritarian regimes, the rhetorics that inflame people's passions and draw them towards state powers.
Mhm.
So, and then of course we have our pals on the left, sometimes a rather patriarchal left, that
Mhm.
dismisses feminism, queer, gay, lesbian, trans issues, along with disability issues and animal issues,
Mhm.
as non-serious or secondary or tertiary.
Mhm.
And they're also making a mistake, because the attack on gender is an attack on the left. It's an attack on critical thought. It's an attack on democracy.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to get people to think a little bit more seriously about this attack as something we all need to reckon with at this time. I don't know how to do that if I'm screaming.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like screaming,
Yeah.
and I have screamed,
Yeah.
been known to scream. But
Yeah.
for the purposes of trying to get people to see the importance of this, I felt like I needed to go slow
Mhm.
and lay it out, and not be involved in the
Mhm.
hurling of invective that very often characterizes these
Mhm.
debates, if they are debates.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it kind of leads into something else I wanted to talk to you about, which is that like one of the main relations in this book that I felt like I was charting throughout was fury and its relationship to fear. And I think that right away, obviously, by the title, which obviously has afraid in it, um, and it seemed to me that it was that by shifting the attention to who's afraid of gender, what do people fear, to me that's an empathetic gesture. um, because it also makes space that um, you know beneath the fury there may be fear, and beneath the fear there may be other things that that we can get through together. I guess in the kind of Shoshana Fillman adage that like the scene of reception is a repetition of the scene of the issues of a book itself. I feel like the some things that I've seen, which I won't name them here, but kind of like people like insist like, oh, we're not fearful, we're just furious, which kind of like keeps us on this Mobius strip.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was really, but I was really fascinated by that formulation. Especially because you do say at certain points in the book, like especially talking about people who would kind of deny trans existence, like that there, that people, when we feel angry, often we feel angry, rightfully so, and I think you use that phrase more than once about fury. And then there's I guess kind of an argument or a proposition that the fury, like the screaming in the airport or the heightened escalated debate you're talking about, is really more of a kind of a, I don't know if I would say a misunderstanding, but maybe like a lost opportunity to think about what its ingredients are. And I think it is, but then of course, no matter how calm, one runs the risk of like, no one wants to, both fury and fear seem like things that people have to, like there's something about them that's crying out for, I'm not arguing that you or I do this, but calling out for acknowledgement in some way. But it's very difficult to which I guess leads into this whole question, which is a kind of a separate thing about good faith and bad faith actors, and another Mobius strip of like, how in the hell are you supposed to tell the difference when I think even in some of these same individuals, maybe they don't know if they're a good or bad faith actor, or they flicker in and out based on their mood or their reactionary status. But I wonder just if you, in writing out more about Fear and Fury, if there was anything about their relationship that you learned or thought about writing the book.
Yes. Well, thank you. I did write something a year or two ago on fury and justice in the humanities, looking at the humanities. And so I'm interested in fury for sure. And I'm also mindful, that Audre Lorde told us rightly that our anger is giving us important information.
Right.
But, when she said that, we still were stuck with the task of
Right.
understanding how to get at that information, how to interpret it. And I mean, what's interesting to me is that the people who say, right, so trans exclusionary feminists would say, well, trans women are trying to take our womanhood away, or they're trying to take over the category, or they're seeking to violate us through occupying the category, right? These are the kinds of arguments that are generally made. And in turn, they try to stop them from being women. They don't acknowledge it. They sometimes misgender them, or they pathologize them. And I think that they end up denying the sexed identity of other people, right, of trans people. And the way they do that is to say that trans people are denying, overtaking, violating, effacing, appropriating their sexed identity. So the thing they fear that will happen to them is the thing they actually then do to the other group. So if we read it that way, they're stripping people of the right to have the sexed identity that they have, out of fear that their rights to their own sexed identity will be stripped of them. They will be stripped of those rights. And Giorgia Meloni makes that argument in a conservative right-wing way, but trans exclusionary feminists make that argument in a different way. So the furious act of rights stripping is perhaps a way of deflecting, in the name of self-defense, from the aggression that one is actually performing, the violence that one is performing. So in order to show that logic, one does have to move somewhat slowly, because it's not a contradiction that most people are willing to look at. My other answer to that is that I think most of us are living with a lot of fear. I know that most young people I talk to have fear about the future, or have already given up. Fear about climate change, fear about hypercapitalism and its destructive dimensions, fear about racism, fear about the wars that are continuing, the brutality that's committed in shameless ways with the approval of major powers in this world, as we see in Palestine. I think that we all have reasons to be fearful. But if an authoritarian comes along and says, what's the cause of your fear? Gender. Like, if gender were gotten rid of, then the cause of all your fear and anxiety will also be allayed. And there are arguments to this effect, like when the Vatican says gender is a diabolical ideology. Pope Francis, despite his sometimes progressive views, is really saying it comes from the devil, and it is the contemporary representation of the devil. Now, for a lot of people, that's really, really frightening. because the only thing you can do with devil or the evil is to run it out of town or to burn it or to kill it or to somehow put an end to it. So it's a literal, I'm going to say a literal demonization. And I think some of the exaggerated fears of gender we see among trans exclusionary feminists don't really recognize the vulnerability of the communities that they are seeking to disenfranchise or belittle or efface.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what you're describing, and this is my most in the weeds moment, but we don't have to go totally into the weeds, but I have a lot of questions about moral sadism.
Yes.
And it seems to relate to this because obviously what you're describing about the literal demonization is a license for moral sadism. But I guess my question is, I mean, we can talk about what moral sadism is and how it works. And I think your book does a lot of work on that account. But you also, I guess I also kept thinking about the question of how moral, and this is back to the kind of good bad faith actors, like how a moral sadism, meaning like harm to others that has a justification, an ethical justification, or moral justification, how it works in conjunction with, I guess one might say, immoral sadism, or what you sometimes, I think, call in the book shameless sadism, which may be, shameless sadism may be moral sadism, but I feel like what I'm describing kind of about the good bad faith actors makes me feel like a lot of the anti-gender stuff, and partly why I myself have a very difficult time and why I'm offering you so much gratitude for kind of sifting through it, is that the meanness and, as you're describing, the snideness and the degradingness, which can be as, something just as much like, dead naming all the way to like death threatening or physical actual violence. But there's just so much, this nastiness that is so, that it feels like the contagion of that moves something from, well, maybe moral sadism is already there because it's sadistic, but there's something, that much more gets into like a disinhibited sadistic space that needs no moral justification. And that's, truly frightening. And I think we can see that happening in different places. And I even see it happening in people who maybe didn't start there and then kind of, via the algorithm end up there, and kind of this red pill curious to full on, and the door, as many people smarter and more research based than myself have noted, the door seemingly goes one way. It doesn't seem as though there's a lot of, it seems as though a lot of, so-called left or liberal people, find that revolving door and move down that algorithm in a way that doesn't always work in reverse. So yeah, I just wonder about moral sadism, and is there such a thing as, like, or immoral or shameless sadism as a kind of,
no, that's a great question. Yeah. It's a great question. And I think they are different. And I take your point that the one can morph into the other.
Yeah.
But I think moral sadism gives itself, it's a sadism that gives itself a moral alibi. Like, I am preventing harm to children. I am preventing harm to women. I'm protecting women in the bathrooms. I'm protecting women in the prisons. And what am I protecting them against? I'm protecting them against trans women who are endowed with, attributed with a distinctive capacity to do harm. Right. So I'm on the side of no harm to women, no harm to children, right? It's very Christian. It's very, it has a lot of moral pathos. Now, it doesn't matter that one misnames the source of violence against women and children. I mean, women in prison are, as we know, assaulted and violated by guards, by other women. If we really want to see, like, where does the violence happen in prison against women, I think we could probably document that. We could find one or two examples of trans women, but it would be appalling to then say, oh, all the harm against women in prison comes from them, rather than say the structural violence of the prison system. I mean, it's an astonishingly economical and bad argument that is made against trans women, especially using the prison or the bathroom settings. But there is a moral alibi given, And when people come at you with their arguments, they're like, so you don't care about harming women. You're not a feminist. Are you a feminist? So there is that. But shameless sadism seems to me not to need a moral alibi. And I think of Trump as a shameless sadist. I think I think DeSantis kind of uses Christianity to his advantage. I don't know what his interiority is like, but my sense is that it's instrumentalized for the purposes of a certain kind of sadistic attack. But even there, it's against women, it's against gay and lesbian people, their parenting, it's against trans people. And we have to, I think, remember that these anti-gender movements are not just against trans people, they're also against feminism. That's the painful paradox of feminists joining in any kind of echoey way with the right-wing anti-gender ideology movement. And I'm not saying they always know that they're doing this. I don't think they always do, but their rhetoric and their argumentation does recapitulate it in ways that are eerie and damaging.
Well, it's almost like if they don't know by now, then I think we do move from moral alibi to a new realm, because I think people know by now. And so, as you say, I think you say, I can't remember your phrasing at a certain point, you say like soon, people, like, you're very generous in calling the alliances unwitting. And then you say at a certain point, like, soon there'll be a time to make a choice, which is kind of a potentially chilling formulation, but it also may be just as more and more of, as less can be claimed as unwitting, then maybe a choice becomes more.
Yeah, I mean, there is an invitation that I try to keep open. It's like, hey, folks, how do you account for aligning your rhetoric with that of right-wing, racist, anti-feminist, anti-migrant, anti-ecological, authoritarian movements that are relying on the stoking of fascist passions. And look, we know fascist passions are contagious. They tend to be unbridled. They seek the moment of disinhibition and of increasing levels of disinhibition. But the more you have a moral alibi at your disposal, it keeps you from seeing that the damage you're doing actually replicates the damage you claim to fear. So it actually allows a kind of splitting. So you can do the damage you claim you are defending yourself against. And that's a kind of split phantasm if we're going to kind of go psychoanalytic about it. But I think there's a structure of disavowal that it puts in place, which allows for an increasingly unbridled form of sadism.
I mean, there's something, I think, in what you're describing about the contagion and about the logic, there's something, and about kind of increasing levels of disinhibition, like there's something that can feel so disturbingly like conveyor belt, about that, like once the disinhibitedness starts spreading. I mean, to me, like, I don't know, just autobiographically, like as like a sober person, like it always, and this, I'm not the first person to talk about whether it's white supremacy or whatnot, trying to combat it with an addiction model. Like there's something that feels like watching a drunkenness, like a kind of take over. And I think what's so scary, if you continue that model, it's that like it has to hit like a bottom, like it has to break, like the fever has to break. And I think a lot of us are probably engaged in wondering how to make that bottom higher, like the highest bottom it can have. And yet it has to, in some ways, the people who, which you write very eloquently, if frighteningly, about when in, maybe it's in nonviolence, but more also in this book, about a kind of like, the grip of destructiveness, and how much momentum a kind of nihilistic or grip of destructiveness can have. And I don't know, like, I'm not asking you to figure out how to, I'm not asking you to put you on the spot of how to stop it, but maybe the question in part is because scholars of autocracy have mentioned this as well, like, don't fall into the feeling of the inevitable. So as something becomes contagious, how do we know, like, what are our steps?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, if a violent crowd is coming at you, your step is to get out of the way.
Yeah.
But also to find a way to counter a very seductive and exciting phantasm, right? The phantasm of gender is destructive, for instance, with an even more powerful counter imaginary. For instance,
Yep.
Most feminists, myself included, kind of grew up fighting violence against women, wanting to walk the street at night without fear, wanting to go into a job interview and not be discriminated against, not wanting, say, or if you're lesbian or gay or queer, you don't want to lose your apartment. You don't want to suffer job discrimination. You don't want to suffer violence, domestic, public, of whatever kind. I mean, these are our basic precepts. We can differ on a whole lot of other issues, but they are basic precepts. And why would we not recognize that the same people, the same governments that want to strip trans people of their rights or not allow them even to have those rights to begin with, are attacking reproductive health. They're attacking reproductive justice. They're attacking gay and lesbian parenting. They're attacking the rights of single people to bear children. There are so many ways in which progressive legislation is being rolled back, and rolled back in the service of a kind of restoration fantasy, like, oh, let's go back to patriarchy where everybody knew their place and it was a beautiful hierarchy and men were men and women were women and heterosexuality was everywhere and marriage was the ultimate and once married, reproduction, etc. I mean, what's happening right now is anti-feminist. So at least those folks should be waking up to the fact that we have several regimes and fascist movements in the world that are taking aim at all of us at the same time. So there is a question of, are you going to widen your lens and take that in? Or are you going to stay in your local internecine battle? So I was recently in the UK and it was as if I didn't write any of the chapters on the global movements or what's happening all around the world. It was as if I hadn't written the chapters on authoritarianism or the relationship between authoritarian regimes and fascist passions. It was all just like, so what would you say to the following trans exclusionary feminist? Or, what do you think of the term gender critical? Or, it just like went right back to the local. And I was supposed to be part of those battles rather than allowing those battles to get resituated in a global framework, which allows you to see what the stakes are.
Yeah.
And you want to be against authoritarianism. You want to be against fascism, no matter what kind of arguments you're having with the people who live next door to you.
Yeah, I was in Spain not so long ago and doing an event, and they had, I think maybe you might have done this too, actually, I'm not sure you did it, but like where there were a bunch of high school kids that come to the museum to do the event. And one of the kids asked me why I thought fascism was opposed to freedom. But it was really like, at the time I was kind of, I don't know, I had all kinds of reactions, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since, because I mean, to him, I just rattled off, it was like freedom to assemble, freedom, like many of the freedoms you just named, I just kind of rattled off freedoms, but it made me realize that there was a historical problem going on,
Yes.
there was a historical knowledge problem going on, and or the same history repeating itself of, it will be subjugation for all others save myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people could say they want to be free from wokeism. They want to be free from migrants. They want to be free to return to the past. I mean, they can turn it in all kinds of ways that,
Right.
and fascism has always sold itself as an expressive freedom,
Yep.
frighteningly enough.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as you might have imagined, when the word freedom comes up in this book, my ears always perked up, having
Sure.
a book on freedom. And I think that, one thing that I was focused on in that book, which you ask at a certain point, I think, when you're having this passage about a kind of mocking of freedoms that can take place. And I think, and you ask, why is freedom so frightening? And I think it kind of became apparent to me over and over again that, and I mean, Jacqueline Rose and other people have said this, it's not new from, many, many people, but that there's not just a question of wanting freedom for others being difficult at times, if we think that it conflicts with the freedom we want for ourselves, however illusory the construction, as you've named out, about the feeling that trans people, by existing, are stripping an identity from others, but also internal resistances of our own to freedom. And Jacqueline Rose has, talked about that the voice, and other people, again, she's probably quoting other people too, but like that the voice that can tell you to care about others inside your head can be a super ego voice that's like also not nice. And there's this kind of so I guess it's a really hard sell, I figured, in that book, that an expressive freedom that demands very little save disinhibition versus a difficult freedom that you hold and bear and abide is, one is a lot harder to sell than the other. However, in my opinion, one is abiding and one is momentary and ends in tears,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think I don't go deep into the question of freedom in this book because the book is trying to make an argument about how you can, curiously enough, be in favor of one set of freedoms in a principled way and have a full argument for why those freedoms are good. But those same set of freedoms you may not be willing to allow others to have. And so what is the block that happens between wanting and claiming them for oneself or one's group and refusing to allow another group to have them? I mean, philosophically, we'd say it's a failure of generalization or universalization. But, it's also part of a kind of war mentality. Like, I want these freedoms, and that means I also want freedom from this other group, and I don't want them to participate in freedom because freedom is zero sum, and if they have freedom, it gets taken away from me, right? Rather than shared, right? So there is a collective idea of freedom or a shared idea of freedom that is, I suppose, pulsing through the book, which is my own wish, which is really hard. And I must say, the one thing I have come up against in writing this, as I read, and I had to read a lot of right-wing material, right? And I had to read sociological documentation of right-wing movements, and I certainly read a fair amount of trans-exclusionary feminist literature as well. People really don't like equality. Yeah. They don't want to share freedom equally. They don't want freedom to be shared equally. A lot of people, they are just appalled by equality, and they actually experience equality as effacement. And it keeps them from saying, yes, these very protections against discrimination that I demand for myself, say, as a feminist or as a woman, I do not want anyone else to be able to have, even though they suffer very similar forms of violence, discrimination, pathologization, criminalization. So, that there is something very strange and sad about that failure to want to think of freedom as something that can be shared and even augmented rather than something that is a matter of scarcity and that has to be hoarded or protected against others who want to make claims of freedom on very similar grounds, if not always the exact same.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'm trying to look at of my 24 questions, what maybe one or two should be my last, should be my final ones before opening it up, because I really would rather ask them all. But I guess in your hopefulness about people kind of, as you say, like waking up and making this analysis about a shared freedom and the unwitting alliances they might not want to be a part of. You know, you talk at a certain point saying like, okay, yes, for some people specifically, I think you're talking about people with a particular religious version about gender. You say something like, there is something to mourn, like they will have the most to mourn, and let's hope they start doing it so they can get into a more productive relation. And I guess I was linking that, let's hope they start doing it, with kind of this discussion you had about J.K. Rowling about trauma. And I was thinking, you're not doing this, but I was thinking that this kind of like, let's hope they start mourning, or kind of like Rowling clearly has, I mean, I'm not saying this is just like has been said and is I think a fair interpretation, like trauma being expressed in that particular essay or in things about sexual assault or abuse that are then being reconfigured to land on trans people. So what I'm saying you're not saying is this kind of like, get a therapist already, or like go mourn that somewhere else and come back to the table when you're ready. But it reminded me of a lot of issues going on now in and around where this work needs to get done. You know, I don't really have an answer, and it reminded me of Maurice Mitchell and that piece that went around a lot, the director of the Working Families Party, that went around a lot. You know, he spent some time in that piece talking about the way, I'll just quote like a couple lines. He said, discerning what is yours to hold and what is the collective's to hold is an essential life skill and fundamental to organizational work, collaboration, and the meaningful engagement of others. And he basically says organizations don't have the specialized skills to provide emotional or spiritual healing. And he kind of goes on about saying like the workplace isn't the place, you know, although we can point you in some good directions. But like you, I know so many students or people who are kind of like, where, like where? And I just wonder what you think about that problem.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, I like the citation.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what's yours to hold and what belongs to the common conversation and struggle. But you know, I mean, a whole lot of people suffered sexual trauma and sexual violence, and I barely know anybody who doesn't have some kind of story. If you're a woman, you're queer, you're young boys. I mean, so many people have stories of this kind, and we've also seen how people can make generalizations on the basis of who they were violated by, like, oh, this kind of man, or all men, or this kind of person, or this race, or this ethnicity. You know, you can go that way. You can generalize that way, and you have to check yourself from doing that, right? And you can decide that a trans woman now is the site of phobia that I have, or one has, for a trauma that one suffered. And I'm not psychoanalyzing J.K. Rowling. She's the one who allows her trauma to preface and inform the argument she makes. So she puts it on the page, and there's that language. But there are ways of working through that trauma to understand it as shared, and also to differentiate among the people who did in fact impose that, who were in fact the violators. Like, how do we go about repairing or healing from that form of violation? And how do we make sure we don't reproduce it so that we start violating others in different ways, as a way of gaining agency or power in a scene where we once, a phantasmatic scene where we once felt without power. So the idea of the phantasmatic is important here because it allows us to think about how one group of people can start to replace another, or how displacement works, also how inversion works so that we don't see ourselves in the very action that we're performing. And that's not to pathologize people. We all do this. We're all living within phantasmatic scenes. But we do need to be able to read them and also understand that we share some of those scenes with each other and we can work them through.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of what fiction does, Maggie. I mean, you do it in your work. I've always been impressed by the ways in which you feel like you make the argument that our most difficult and intransigent passions get put into a work of art and come out somehow altered. It's like, what is that process? And we ask that of art, we ask it of therapy, we also ask it of friendship, we ask it of social movements.
Yeah.
We ask it of public discourse that actually touches or moves us in the place where we're confused,
Yeah.
or we don't know how to think.
Yeah.
We're grateful to people who disturb our epistemic habits, and let us think something in a fresh way. It happens in education.
Yeah.
There are multiple venues, I would say.
Yeah.
It's the process we need to be able to identify and ask, what can this venue do to hasten or encourage that kind of transformative process? And maybe it's also one of the ideals of transformative justice, if we think about it.
Yeah. Right.
What do we do with our sense of injury and violation? How do we seek repair, not only with and for the person who inflicted, but for ourselves? And I think there are ways of doing that that do not reproduce it and that do not immediately seek recourse to carceral power to repair it.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe as a final thing, I would just add to that in a, hopeful fashion, is that I think repair has great contagious value too. Often people find that one repair, well made, filters through the rest of their life, and and changes their outlook and the way that they treat others and themselves. So, but I have so many more things, but I'm mindful of the time and your time and other people's too.
I'll just say one thing about mourning.
Oh yeah, okay, great.
Well,
yeah.
Some of the right-wing folks I talked to in Latin America, for instance, said that gender would destroy their families. And I said, no, I don't really think that's true. I wasn't quite sure why that would happen. Gender's probably already inside the family. What do they mean by gender? And well, if it's all constructed, not really caring to find out what construction means, if it's all constructed, that means the natural and necessary sense I have of being a father as a cis man, as a natal man, is destroyed. And I said, well, no, you can still be a father, you can still have your heterosexual family. You just can't assume that your particular way of organizing kinship or family is the same for everybody, or has to be the same, or has a kind of universal status. You're going to have to, that's what you have to lose. That's what you have to mourn. Similarly with white supremacy. I mean, they do have, I mean, if they want to live in a world of equality, they have to mourn the loss of their conviction that they somehow belong to a supremacist racial identity, and they're going to have to give that up. And maybe that's hard for them. I don't want to know too much about it, but they do have to go through that in order to enter into a world of equal cohabitation. So getting to equality does, for many people who've had systemic privileges, involve a certain kind of mourning and acceptance of loss.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, where are we with time?
So I think we could take a few questions, and we've got some trickling in here. Sonia asks, I'm really interested in one of Professor Butler's earlier pieces. Is kinship always already heterosexual? Do you think this is still relevant today? And if so, in what ways?
Well, quickly, I mean, I think there are people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, and his Republican Party affiliates here in the US, who would like to roll back gay and lesbian parenting and gay and lesbian families, trans parenting, and the like. So part of the restoration project of right-wing anti-gender ideology people is precisely to restore a so-called natural family. For Orban, it's not just natural, but it's also national, which is why he's against migration and against miscegenation. So I guess we'd have to rewrite that thesis. It's not just that there are those who seek to make all kinship organized through heterosexual relations, but also nationalist and white relations as well. So we have quite a cluster there. Sure, I think it's still relevant. It would have to be rewritten for today and probably include more modalities of power than it was able to deal with at the time.
We have a question from Nancy. The deconstruction of gender to dismantle the artificial social construction of gender can be liberatory for all human beings towards some more authentic ways of being human. I see this in your work. Could you discuss it, please?
Well, I'm not sure I think of gender as artificial. You know, when we say that gender is socially constructed, it means we're kind of deeply formed by histories, by childhood, by institutions. This is a real formation. It's not an artificial one. And I don't think we just throw it off easily. But for some people, obviously, the assignment that they're given, the roles they're expected to live in, the norms according to which they're supposed to live, are not really livable. At which point, those norms break down, and hopefully something more livable, if not emancipatory, emerges. But I don't think we throw off gender to become simply human. The category of the human has been gendered from the beginning. So we might have to rethink the human, and maybe at this point in ecological catastrophe, resurrecting the human is not the best way to go.
Sarah says, I heard you say once that growing up you wanted to be either a philosopher or a clown. Can you speak to the relationship between the fear of gender and humor and play?
Yeah, lovely. Sorry, I'm not very funny tonight because I'm tired. But it is true that I didn't know if I wanted to be a philosopher or a clown. I think joy is really important. I think humor is really important, and there's never been a good revolution without both. I would add music, kind of citing Emma Goldman, and The Life of Desire. So play is great if you can play. Not all of us can play. You know, everybody who, oh, I'm playing with gender. It's like, okay, cool, that's cool. But most of us have a kind of limit, like, that's not play. That's not really a zone of play. That's kind of who I am, or the limits of what I can be. So I think we have to think those kinds of constraints in relation to play. But yes, I affirm play when and where it can happen without harm, which is usually the case.
Let's see, I think we have time for a couple more. Darren asks, is the Vatican calling in the laws of keeping things separate in Leviticus? That book is about the fallacy of the excluded middle. Nothing is sort of kosher. So is that where gender binary rigidity might come from?
You're getting your Judaism and your Christianity confused, my friend. Okay, here, the Vatican, in its most recent 2019 statement on gender, and even before, makes clear that it's Genesis that is at issue, because God created male and female, and then gender came along. Remember, gender is the devil. Gender came along and decided, oh, we create whatever gender we want to be. What did gender do, right? Personified now as the devil. Gender stole the creative power from God, right? And what good Christians need to do is banish this devil in order to restore to God the rightful creative powers that belong only to him. That's what I'm reading in the Vatican doctrine that I've been studying.
I think we will make this our final question comment. Faye says, thank you very much for your sharing. I would love to hear more about your ideas about the role/power of language in your discussion on fears in today's gender movements.
Well, first of all, let me just say, before we finish, that I'm really grateful that Maggie Nelson agreed to join me tonight. She didn't have very much time to prepare in advance, and those were just splendid questions, and I'm always enormously grateful and moved to be in conversation with her. I want to just say this about language. It's historical and it's living, which means it's never accomplished once and for all. We all live with coinages and changes, and in English, the experimentation with pronouns is extremely interesting. People are trying to find their way. They're trying to find ways of either nuancing the binary or living outside of it. Those are, I think, really important pathways. And those of us who are older, or even not older, but skeptical, should perhaps develop greater respect and recognition for the kinds of efforts that people are making to find a language that's inhabitable for them, for their bodies. But we shouldn't get so bogged down in English, otherwise we become monolingual. And in this world right now, we need to have multilingual perspectives on gender. And sometimes that means getting rid of the idea of gender, paradoxically, after all this, because it doesn't work in every language. And we know that to be the case. To the extent that there is gender, say, in a number of East Asian languages or many languages from Africa or outside of the Romance languages, it's not always something that one can be or something that one can have. So we have to listen carefully to how those inflections work in other languages in order to develop a more global understanding of the topic at hand.
Well, I would like to thank you both. Ever grateful for this very vital, very thoughtful, really important discussion. And Maggie Nelson, thank you for doing the honors tonight. That was just fantastic.
So many more, but we'll meet again, Judith, and we'll get down the list.
I hope so. I trust that will happen. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Really fun.
And thank you, Peter. Thanks for hosting us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and buy books from City Lights. They're the best.